welcome to another edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I am your host for this week, Tom Bassam, and on this week's pod, we're going to be talking about podcasting. More specifically, of course, sports podcasting. And for this, I am lucky enough to be joined by a real expert in this field and someone who is, quite frankly, very entertaining to podcast with. And that is Luke Moore, who is the Chief Operating Officer of London-based pod production company, Stak. Stak is best known for being the production company behind the very popular football show over here, the Football Ramble, which has been running for more than 16 years, I want to say. And during my conversation with Luke, which is lengthy and goes off in various different tangents, we talk about the secrets of making a successful sports podcast, what makes it engaging, why Stak has just enjoyed such great longevity in that format, and what's kind of coming next for that company. It's a really interesting conversation if you are at all in the fields of content creation and also just the industry around podcasting. It's a huge industry. It's growing in this country. It's not fully matured yet, but we're at a point where it's now a very significant part of the national media, more specifically the national sports media. So yeah, hopefully you enjoy the conversation. Luke Moore, welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thanks for having me.
It's slightly odd having you sort of in vision rather than just through my ears. I've been a long time Football Ramble listener.
I was about to say, I hope that's nothing I've done to make it
No, not at all. I mean, we'd appreciate slightly less swearing on this podcast.
No problem. I'll be on my best behaviour. I'll do my what I call grandparents mode, where I don't swear at all.
Am I right in thinking, so the Football Ramble was, like the first show was 2008? Is that right?
2007. But I would say probably for the first couple of years, the listenership was very, very minimal. So, I mean, we started to make podcasts, technically then, but I think probably around 2008 is when we properly started to build something of an audience and maybe at least semi-professionalised what we were doing.
Did you have another job at that point?
I had a full-time job until 2017.
Right.
So I did it alongside work for 10 years.
And now you are, what is your job title at Stak?
Chief Operating Officer and co-owner.
How does that feel?
Yeah, kind of just like permanently making it up as I go along. Don't know what I'm doing.
Same.
Basically, yeah, I think everyone's like that. No, I think, so my role essentially, as well as being broadcaster on The Ramble and one or two other shows and overseeing in an exec production kind of role some of our other stuff, like our narrative bits and some of our white label stuff, my main job is really taking responsibility and overseeing all the creative and content side of the business. So Stak is owned by myself, my business partner John Teague, and then Pete Donaldson, who you'll know from The Ramble as well. Pete is creative director. John is the CEO, so he does the strategy division, all the off-air stuff, the commercial arrangements, the legal stuff, everything like that, and I take responsibility for all the content.
I'd like to kind of come back to that division of labour a little bit later on. But so 2007 it starts, 2008 you start to professionalise it a little bit. When did you sort of first realise you were onto something that could pay your wages? I guess not until 2017.
Yeah. Those are kind of separate questions, I think. So I think that when I realised I was onto something, it was when we started to genuinely get good, consistent listener numbers and feedback from people who are passionate about the show. Now, in terms of the numbers, it's small at the time compared to what it is now. But it was clear to me, looking back, that the people who liked it, really liked it. It was almost like the difference between, oh yeah, that's quite nice, I quite enjoy listening to that, and people down the pub on the Saturday saying to their friends, you've got to listen to this, it's brilliant, kind of thing. I'm not saying it was brilliant, but that's people were just basically convincing their friends to listen. And the reason that has to be the case is because we had absolutely no budget whatsoever. So we weren't doing anything to market the show other than just making the show. This is even before you could properly leverage social media. That came along a little bit later, and we did do that. But when we started to build the audience month on month and year on year, it genuinely has to have been by word of mouth. It's the only way it could have happened. So that's when we started to know we had something. And then we would start to do things like we would ask listeners to turn up at a pub on a certain day at the end of the season and we'd have a drink, or come to Regent's Park in central London and play football with us on a Saturday afternoon. After a while, there was just too many people to do that. You couldn't do that anymore, right? And given that the people who were actually going to turn up is a tiny fraction of what the audience is, you can't understand that it became a lot bigger. And then on the financial side, that's not just a question of The Ramble that's a question of the maturity of the podcasting industry generally, right? So back then, if you had millions of listeners, that would be fine. But the question is, how can you monetize that? Are there people there to invest in that sector? And that's something that's come along later and is still growing now. So a long-winded answer to a pretty simple question. The second part of the answer is just that probably when we moved to Acast in 2014, when Acast entered the market, and I know the CEO of Acast, worked with him back in the day at Capital Radio, and I knew a couple of the other guys then as well. And we were the first UK podcast to go and work with them, and they promised us they'd monetize our show. And they did. And then it went from there. And then the inertia between that 2014 to 2017 was when I could move across full time. And then in January of 2018 is when I started Stak with the guys.
And that transition with Acast, I'm guessing they were doing what? Selling your ads?
Tech support.
Studio?
No. Studio we had ourselves. We built our own studio. We had access to studios before that because one or two of us worked in radio. I'm sure we won't get in trouble for it now because that ship has long since sailed, but we would sneak into places when everyone else had gone and record them in professional studios, which did set us apart, I think, at the time. And then actually we went through a phase of just recording it in bedrooms and soundproofing things. And we had but it was just the four of us on the Ramble, Marcus, Pete, Jim and I. We had this kind of intimacy of show where we didn't really want anyone else around and we didn't want to be kicked out of places halfway through a record or all that kind of stuff. So it worked well doing it in a kind of bedroom with a lot of soft furnishings. The sound was fine and you could kind of be yourself because the show is ultimately about authenticity, right, of opinion and cutting through the kind of bullshit of ex-pros and journalists and stuff like that. That's what it has to be. Mm-hmm. And that enabled us to best be that kind of, give it that kind of feel.
You hear that quite a lot, actually, when we talk to creators, even like professional clubs, they come to our events, they listen to our podcast, they read our content, to try and like find out like what it is that makes successful things successful. And actually quite a lot of the time it's something that you can't really flick a switch. Like authenticity comes from, like you said, it comes from sneaking into studios. It comes from the fact that you have an original voice. Like, did you kind of think about that, or is that just like you don't really, it's there?
First of all, I think a lot of success in this area is intangible. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable to think of that. And I think people don't want to think about it like that. I think clearly there has to be a level of competency and talent, but I don't know of anyone who can prove as to why X show is popular and Y show isn't, even though there's not that much difference between them. You know, sometimes we work at Stak on developing shows, obviously a lot, and sometimes shows fly and sometimes they don't, and you do all the same things, all the right things to give yourself the best chance of success, but you don't get it. And sometimes you do something because you think, it's an opportunity, we'll just do it, and it flies. I find there's a lot of snake oil in this stuff, whether it's through social media platforms saying if you do this, you'll get this, and pay this agency this amount of money and you'll get loads of followers. We can maximize your potential in terms of your podcast audience. We guarantee this, we guarantee that. My personal view is that it's just all nonsense. I don't see any tangible proof or evidence that is consistently the case. There's a strong element of this kind of lightning in a bottle idea where it just resonates with people. And then on your specific question around, did we think about that? Did we know about that? What I feel like after however many years it's been of doing this is a really strong temptation to try and backfill the narrative in retrospect. And I always try and avoid doing that because I don't think it's that helpful. And I also just don't think I probably just don't think it's true either. I think that my perception of what happened 15 years ago and why it happened is probably not that helpful. We were conscious that we had something. We're conscious that we enjoyed making the show, which is key. There was nothing else out there like it, for better or worse. And what we have been good at, I think, is totally maximizing the opportunity, taking it to its natural conclusion, not kind of shying away from it. We lost a few people along the way, changed a few things around along the way, but what's really galvanized John, me, Pete, Marcus, Jim, and now Vish and Andy on the Ramble side is a desire to always want to be good and always want to be successful and always be dedicated to it. I mean, we've never missed a scheduled show in 17 years of doing it, and that stands for itself. And then what you then try and do is replicate that across the Stak, which is a dynamic, independent podcast company which tries to apply those principles to every show it does.
Yeah. You feel like a snake oil salesman if you say, I've got the formula for how this works. Do you have something that you do when you're setting up a new show? Like, okay, well, that works there. Is it a case of just collective experience or like trying and failing?
There's a toolbox, right, that you can use where it's cross-promotion across other shows, leveraging relationships with other companies. You give them a bit, they give you a bit, getting yourself out there, using PR people. That stuff all needs to happen, I think, these days because it's a crowded marketplace. But, I mean, it's like any product, product's got to be good. People want to buy it. Branding's got to be right. All the stuff that people cringe away from about marketing and advertising and selling people stuff. You've got to do that. And then even then, sometimes it won't work. I'm not saying that there aren't great people out there who can't make successful shows. There's loads of companies doing it at an independent level and a bigger level, of course. I just don't think there's a playbook that always works. If you do X and Y, you'll receive Z. I just don't think that exists. And then maybe that's because I'm not that good. But I've been doing it a long time and I've never been exposed to that kind of idea I've been convinced by, I would say. But yeah, the answer is, of course, you do everything you can to make it successful. And maybe there's companies out there that have got better resources than us that can give themselves an even better chance. But I also know that we've launched shows that have just flown. They've just hit something with people and they love it. And they subscribe and they're loyal and they tell their friends and away you go.
What's Stak's model now in terms of like how you generate revenue? Is it primarily ads? Is it creating things specifically for brands? How do you sort of dice that all up?
It's a bit of everything really, because I think what you don't want to be as an independent company is too brittle on how you generate revenue, because if you are, especially, look at what's happened in the economy in the last year, 18 months. If you're super exposed to advertising and sponsorship revenue and then people don't want to advertise or sponsor, you're cooked, right? So clearly, advertising and sponsorship is a huge part of how we make our money, but we've tried to consciously diversify those revenue streams between things like building Patreon audiences for the bigger shows and doing white label work and branded work and things like live shows, just to be as diverse as possible around how it's possible to make money. But ultimately as well, in the podcasting industry, these things are being worked out as we speak now. It's a young, maturing industry. There's no. One of the things that's I think most exciting about it is there's no real blueprint. Sometimes you'll see a podcast company that will be tacked onto the side of a wider production company, or let's say someone like the BBC. They're in a completely unique position. Their budgets are their budgets. They're going to get them anyway. They can open up BBC Sounds, chuck money at talent, and do their thing. We're not able to do that, and I don't even know if I'd want to be able to do that because I don't think it's most conducive to making the most interesting and creative work. But at the same time, it would be nice to experiment with a few other things and not have to worry about whether it's going to pay the rent or not, right? That would be good. But the answer is to be as diverse as you can and hopefully stay across the other opportunities that arise as the industry matures, something that John, my business partner, is very, very good at, and something that we bask in the reflected glory of.
You mentioned like inviting people to pubs and playing football in a park. Is the kind of the evolution of that then, that Patreon kind of thing where you basically kind of you monetize that? If that was that successful then, and I interviewed Tony Pasta from Goalhanger recently.
Yeah, I know Tony.
And he was saying that like their membership side of their business, they almost don't want to talk about it because they're like, we don't know how good or bad this is. You've got that many people actively engaged and paying it for things that are like, they're nice to have. Like you get early access to a podcast that people will get for free anyway. Is that something that's like, you're surprised at how dedicated still your followers are?
I'm in a different position to Tony because the way they run their stuff, as far as I know, and I know a little bit about it, but not a lot, they do it slightly differently to us. And I think the way they do their membership stuff is interesting, but the way we do it is slightly different. And for a show like The Ramble, it's a different calculation because we're making so much content anyway. So with, say, just because you've used them as an example, say Goalhangers, The Rest is Politics, they're doing 2 shows a week, right? They're doing their normal show, whatever you want to call it, and their questions show. They provide early access. They provide ad-free stuff. They provide different bits and pieces. I think the most successful or the most efficient way of doing a Patreon or a membership is to offer extra content. So it's to ring fence some of your best content. I'm not a member of their show, so I don't know if they do that. But the problem with The Ramble on that side is that you give the people so much content anyway that it's hard to work out if they have the appetite for more, or whether they just want to support you because they like you, or whether they don't want to hear the ads, or they want early access to tickets. So I think it's a calculation that is quite specific to different shows. And I think we have a show called Wrestle Me, which is so successful on the Patreon side that we don't even release it into the open market now, because we found that the commercial value of it, I think the people who are responsible for selling sponsorship on it, for example, found it quite hard to sell it for whatever reason. I have my own opinions on that, which I probably won't go into, but what the guys were able to do is generate so many members and so many patrons that they just make it for them. And do you know what? If you want to listen to this now, you've got to pay. And that's actually really important for us. That's actually a really important canary in the mine for us, because it goes back to what I said earlier in your previous question. If you're so reliant on sponsorship and the economy's in the toilet, it would be great to know that if it's the right idea and you get the right amount of audience and the right fit, you wouldn't even have to worry about that. You could just get people to pay. And you don't need that many people to turn it into a profit for your business. So I can't remember the exact details, but there's clearly some monetary value to a listener who just listens to one of your shows for a year because of the sponsorship they're exposed to. But if you're paying £8 a month, I know you're worth 8 times 12 a year, and that's going to be far higher than the sponsorship exposure money or the advertising exposure money. So a lot of calculations to be made that are kind of informed by the type of show and the size of listenership and what you're offering already. Because I would say that if you rode back the Ramble to one show a week and then did 2 shows a week behind a paywall, there's a chance you could absolutely explode financially. Like, you could go massive. But there's a chance of loads of people who like the show go, I'm not going to pay for that. There's loads of football stuff out there, I won't bother. We can't risk that, and that's just not how we work. Does that answer your question?
It definitely does. It's a nice way to move into the rest of it. So obviously you started with the Ramble as a football show. We're a sports business podcast, but you diversified in terms of what Stak does, way beyond just doing sports, right?
Yeah.
Did you find when you were doing that, did you feel like it was a bit of a leap of faith? You were going into something that you were, I don't know, like this, you were, we're a sports media company. Was that a tricky mindset shift when you went into doing other stuff, or was it always part of the plan?
I don't think we thought of ourselves as a sports media company ever. I just don't think that was something we considered. Ironically, we are moving towards becoming more of a sports media company now. I think it's something that we've shown through experience that we're better at doing sports stuff. Doesn't mean we won't do anything else, but I think that's something that internally we'll have a focus on, particularly for this year and maybe beyond. But at the time, I can't speak on behalf of the other guys, but obviously we developed a strategy together. Personally, I didn't really think of us as a sports media company. The way I saw it was, we know we can do this, but the money we've made, we've invested into what we're doing. We've built a studio, we've hired staff to give us the room to do the fun stuff in some guy's case. The reality was we were just getting more opportunities, and people were saying, love the Ramble. I've got an idea for a podcast. I want to do this. I want to do that. And then really your responsibility at that point becomes assessing the opportunities and whether you think you can make a success of them, whether you think you can bring something that they can't bring themselves, and whether you can collaborate and genuinely add value. And I've got a lot of interest outside the sport. And so I just felt like I wanted to follow my nose and see what worked. The really interesting question, if I may do your job for a second, would be, would I do it differently again? And I wonder, actually, knowing what I know now and knowing how the industry's matured and knowing how busy it is now, how competitive, maybe I would have stuck to sport, maybe, if I had my time again. And maybe that's why we're leaning more towards sport now.
You talked a few times about how the industry's changed. I mean, you've obviously been in it for a very, very long time. Can you just sort of talk me through that, from your view as a business owner and a senior person in a pretty successful podcasting company? Yeah,
it's important to state that it's only my perspective. I'm also very distrusting of people who position themselves as industry experts and, do all these, willingly do all these talks about things like that. So I'll just give my perspective. I think it's maturing all the time. People are now trusting it more as a place to put their money, whether that's sponsorship, advertising, production, talent, whatever, which is good. Obviously a great thing. I think there's been a big change, particularly the state of how I understand the television industry is at the moment. You see a lot of people wanting to get into podcasts. And so that's a good thing. I think we're, however many years we are behind the US in maturing of the industry and the money in it and the talent in it and stuff. And that's possibly always going to be the case. So that's a positive thing. It's not as you don't have to fight as hard to explain why podcasting should be a place for sponsorship to be. My first challenge always back in the day when we were trying to generate interest for our shows, or in that case, the Ramble, our show then, was to try and explain fully what a podcast was to people. Obviously, I don't have to do that now, so that's obviously good. The con is that, we're an independent company. We've only got a certain amount of resources, and, people come along and steal our lunch or blow us out the water with their budgets or their access to talent or their experience. And, the reality is, we're seeing people come across from more traditional media using their expertise, their contacts, their whatever. And our position is therefore more threatened because ultimately, as callous as it sounds, a lot of time people just don't need us, right? But why is someone really big in TV who's got his own production company going to reach out to us? They just possibly could just do it in-house, right? And do it in as good a way. So we have to think of creative ways to still be relevant in an industry as it grows. And that they would be the two main ways I would say it's grown and changed.
On a sort of technical side, is it, in terms of like the way that the ads work, has it gone from sort of like things like Harry's Shave Club, where like you mention a code, it goes out, you get paid based on how many people use that
bathroom, Harry's Shave Club.
There you go. Yeah. Can't complain about it too much then. But like those kind of referrals through to a more mature advertising model?
As far as I understand it, the way the American podcasting model works is different to here. What I can see here is that, and I worked in commercial radio to start with, and I've worked in TV, and I've worked in music. And so I've had a fairly, not comprehensive, but a fairly kind of global view of how the media industry is. And the way that it seems to work in podcasting here is that people just sell sponsorships and they sell advertising and they sell, in some cases, if you're really lucky, like branded episodes and all that kind of stuff. And the reason it's done that way, I think, is because the people who were in the vanguard of it at the start, i.e. Acast, they built their team out of people like Ross Adams and Joe Copeman and one or two others who are, by tradition, I mean, Ross came through at Capital Radio, then through to Spotify, and then through to Acast. So he's obviously used to doing things and building teams in certain ways. In the US, it doesn't necessarily work like that. There's a lot more referral, a lot more host-read stuff in the US. The stuff you're describing there about mattresses, about Harry's Shave Club, about whatever, that kind of still goes on, and they're just quite different in how they work. And so I can't remember what your original question was, but it's much more traditional in type here. Like, you have a budget to buy media and sponsorship and stuff, and you obviously have a choice to put it on TV or online or radio or podcasting, and it just gets broken up that way. I think at the start, when podcasting was emerging, I felt like, and this may not be the case, but it felt like from where I was, they weren't developing teams at agencies for podcasting specifically then. They were just going, is it radio or is it online? Like, we'll do a bit of both and a bit of neither, and the budgets couldn't really be freed up because no one really knew who was responsible for it. That was the frustration at the start.
And like now, when brands and agencies are a big part of our listenership and who engages with us, what is like, why should a brand or an agency be interested in working with Ramble, Stak now? What is it that you offer that not like, let's say, not within the podcasting industry that's different to other podcasts, but just from where other places they could be spending their money?
Yeah, well, so basically best-in-class service. So we turn around adverts brilliantly. Like, we turn stuff around with in-house producers and sound designers to a world-class level, and we have a reputation of doing that. You go and speak to someone at Acast, they'll tell you the same thing. We turn that stuff around well. We write adverts and sponsorships well in a funny, creative, first, witty way. The quality of the productions are good. And in terms of why they should spend their money specifically in podcasting rather than elsewhere, podcast audiences are super loyal, super engaged. Normally, as far as I know, and this will vary on depending on the podcast itself, of course, but generally pre-affluent, pretty kind of upwardly mobile, tech savvy, all that kind of stuff. Also, the ability to be creative within sponsorship in podcasting is great. I'm forever saying to agencies and to the companies we work with, like Acast, about how, who are responsible for kind of generating this stuff. Bring people in, man. Let's sit down. Let's chat about stuff. Like, I'm not a TV guy who just says you get a solar spot at the start of the football and that's what you get for your £7 million. I'm saying, look, you got money, great. Let's talk about it. We'll make a show that will work really well for our listenership, that will build a hugely positive reputation for your brand, because I'll go on the mic and I'll say, here's a show, everyone, I think you'll like, and we've made it possible with X brand, and don't worry about the fact that it's an advert or an advertorial. It's just going to be a great piece of content. And the one thing I would implore agency staff, people with budgets and decision makers and stuff, to think about is just to be brave. Like, I understand like you're on the hook for spending the money and if it's sufficient or not, or whether you perform well or whether you don't. But be brave. Like, come and make stuff with us. We're happy to hear from you. Like, we don't see it as an inconvenience that, you know, you're going to chuck a commercial message in our show. We love that. Like, our long-term partner on the Ramble, Betfair, we speak to them all the time. We work with them all the time. Like, we love working with them. Like, they've got ideas and sometimes they're not right, and so we'll tell them. But sometimes they're great and we'll just slightly adapt them and put them out. And we try and think of our listeners and put them first, but we also think about making great stuff because our listeners understand that if we don't get paid by sponsors, there's no show. And you know what? If you still don't like that, you can pay £5 a month and not hear any adverts. You know, we give people the option. So there's just a lot of flexibility that I don't think you necessarily get elsewhere. I think radio sponsorship, I just think can be cheesy. It's very rarely done well. TV sponsorship is limited for all the obvious reasons. You know, newspapers, no, does anyone read the newspaper anymore? Yeah, I don't know. Online is spammy. You know, there's loads of reasons why you shouldn't do other stuff. I think podcasting's a really fresh way of doing it, I would say. But then I would say it, wouldn't I? Because I work in podcasting.
Yeah, it's true. You mentioned Betfair. Like, there's been, I mean, this is a sort of an industry discourse, I think. Like, it's sports industry discourse more than podcasting industry, definitely, around the impact of betting around sports content and whether, like, how positive a thing that is, whether or not that's something that needs to be closely regulated. Is that something that you've become, are you concerned about it? Do you think about it, or are you just of the mindset, like, we make a show for over 18s, I think it's okay?
I think the last point was simplistic. We wouldn't, no, we care about our listeners and we care about our shows, and you know, I think you know, people can criticise us, of course, but I think if they were going to criticise, I don't think they'd level that criticism at us. I think we do care a lot about our listenership, just because the way we developed as a company, like, completely organically, and yeah, we've not got a load of seed capital and we're all ex-BBC guys and we're going to just do it. We do care. The sports betting thing is a tricky thing for me because I do like to bet personally. Right, I did work at Betfair for a while. I didn't have a problem doing that, and you know, I also know that a lot of people feel really passionately about it, and I understand that. And I guess my take is broadly, and it's something I've thought about a lot. My take is broadly that I do think there should be regulation. I do think it should be thought about. I do think it should be responsible. And it's not really my position or place to say whether there's too much advertising in certain areas, because I just don't know enough about how the TV industry works or how football as an industry works, really, to make those points. But the way we do it is responsible. The way we do it is something that, you know, is quite light touch and quite accessible and isn't smash you over the head with a sledgehammer. And we don't have the guy from Paddy Power on doing his bit like some football podcasts do. We're in control of how we want to do it. And what's important is that I think our sponsors understand that. They understand that, you know, they want to get value for their money, of course, and why wouldn't you? But they understand, you know, it's actually going to be corrosive and counterproductive to be too full on with it. And, you know, we try and align ourselves with brands that we like. I think Betfair is a good company. I've worked with them for a long time. They looked after me pretty well. I do think about this stuff. And then I would end by saying that, to me personally, it's not a credible argument to say some people are addicted to gambling, therefore gambling shouldn't happen. There are far more people addicted to alcohol than there are addicted to gambling in this country. No one's saying that alcohol shouldn't exist, right? No one's saying people shouldn't drink alcohol, right? Clearly there's a conversation to be had and that has to be handled sensitively, and people need to be looked after. And we don't want to see companies marketing and advertising and pressuring problem gamblers to gamble more. That's not good. No one wants that happening. I certainly don't want that happening. I'm not a spokesman for the gambling industry. What I am in control of is how we do it. And I think we do it in a responsible, entertaining way, in a way that kind of enhances people's week. And that's all we want to do, really.
You mentioned it a little bit there. You don't have any sort of private investment. Is that something you might look at in the future if you wanted to expand? Is that those conversations you've had with other people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to whatever. I think...
we can send out your email address if we get any incoming in traffic.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, please do. Forward it on. Look, my responsibility at Stak is the content and the creative side, right? I have conversations with my business partners regularly about strategy and direction and what we do and why we do it. And, you know, I call John up and say, I want another member of staff, and he says no, and we haven't got any money, and great. And we have all these conversations all the time. It's not a noble position I've taken to be like, oh, we're independent, yeah, we're Raucous Records, we're independent as fuck, we're never going to get any investment. It's not that. It's just that if the right opportunity come along, we'd absolutely consider it. And these conversations happen semi-regularly. There's been offers in the past and opportunities in the past to do certain things in a certain way and to take money from different places, and and I think if it was the right thing for us, we would almost certainly do it. But as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure as your listeners know, people don't just come along and give you money for no reason. Like, they're going to want something in return, and we have to thrash out whether it works for us or not. And it just so happens that it hasn't worked for us yet. But I will also say that our company formed in January of 18, so we're 6 years on. But really, for the first year or so, we didn't have any shows, right? So we had the Ramble, that's pretty much it. So we're a pretty young company still. So maybe that's in our future. There's loads of things I'd love to do now, sitting here now, that I know we can't afford to do. There's loads of ideas that, because of the type of character I am, would back myself to be able to deliver in a really successful way. But I just don't have the money to find out. And if I did have the money, that'd be frightening, because I'd actually have to do it. So, at the moment, I'm a bit like a Lib Dem MP. I haven't actually got to implement any part of my manifesto, so it's pretty easy. But no, all jokes aside, it's not a philosophical position to not do it. It's just not happened yet.
Do you feel like part of that is not the reason why you haven't been approached, but the reason why you're sort of quite works for you being independent, right? Like, you get to do the things you want to do in the way you get to do it.
I mean, that's I don't like working for other people, right? I think looking back on working, to make it all about me rather than Stak, but looking back and when I worked at some other companies, I probably made it quite hard for people I worked for. I was probably prioritising my over them. And that's wrong, because they were paying me. Now, I said to my most recent boss at my most recent quote unquote proper job, who hired me when I was well into the journey with the Ramble, not quite yet into the journey with Stak, but I was in the journey with the Ramble. I said, if it ever gets to a point where I feel like I can't give you what you're paying me for, I'll tell you and we'll talk about it. And he was cool with that. And then in summer of 17, we had that conversation and I ended up leaving, and that's just how it was. So I think I did the right thing. I just think that looking back on some of the parts of it, I wasn't prioritising them. And, if the shoe's on the other foot and my staff aren't prioritising their thing, I'd be pissed off with that. So I think looking back on it, maybe that was something I could have done better.
Do you enjoy being a leader in a business?
I like having the responsibility. I like just putting my head together with my business partners and saying, look, can we do this? And I like being the one that says to my team, I'll give you the most support I can and I'll empower you to do your thing, and you're here because you're good at this particular job. But ultimately, the ultimate responsibility is mine. So what I try, maybe they don't think I do this, but what I try to do is make it clear that if you succeed, it's yours and Stak's success. And if you fail, that's on me, and I'll take that away from you. I'll shoulder that, because then it gives people the freedom to do their best creative work. And I relish that. I think, people who know me will probably say that I don't mind if it's me taking the piss out of people or them taking the piss out of me. I just want to be involved. And I think this is a way I can really be involved. I can be at the centre of it. And for my personality, I think that works for me. I don't ever want to be rushing into someone else's office saying, can I do this? Can I do that? Sorry about this. I've done that. It's just not for me. I feel like I've got an entrepreneurial streak where I just want to succeed and fail on my own terms. And I honestly never worry about it. That's how I know it's for me. And I think John, who I work with really closely, is the same. The source of my stress is never, am I going to be able to feed myself? Am I going to be able to clothe my kids? I never think about that. I just always back myself. And the source of my stress is like, can we get the right member of staff in? Can we deliver this project? Are we going to win that pitch? Are we going to get that show? Are we going to convince someone to work with us? That's the stuff I get stressed about.
I know you've said that you don't think of Stak being a sports media company. I would like to talk a little bit about sports media and just get your general opinions on it. Why is it you resonate? Why is it it's still 14 years on, 15 years on, that Football Ramble, a show with Vish and Andy, you're only they're your traditional journalists, right? Is that the best way of thinking about it?
Yeah, and I don't actually think either of them are traditional journalists in the football space either. But I take the point. Yeah.
I mean, they write for publications and they cover sport.
But they're not coming to the Ramble as that.
No,
that's the key thing I'd like to say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's explore that. That they come to the Ramble as what then, and what do you bring?
We didn't hire them because they were journalists, right? We didn't hire them because they could give us credence or credibility or authority. To be honest, I'm not interested in that. The decision to bring Mark, Vish and Andy in was because we wanted to freshen it up. I don't know. I don't want to say there's tensions within the five, because John obviously is part of it as well, but he's just not on air. I'm not saying there's tensions within the five, but we worked together for a very long time. We have very different people, have different ideas of where you want to go with things. And you bring some fresh people in, And it's not only good for the listeners, it's good for you as well, because it challenges you to set up a new dynamic and to see if you can get that dynamic to fit and see if you can work in a different way. And, they're different people. And we brought them in because we brought Vish on a series we did called Greatest Games, and he was brilliant. And he loved the Ramble. He listened religiously for years. He had the exact balance we need, which is 50% knowledge, 50% entertainment. He understands it's an entertainment show about football, not a football show. And Andy, we'd known since the start. Like, he was just super serious, like super credible, like really successful guy who knew everything about everything, but he just wears it lightly. Like, we didn't go after him because he's a European football kind of savant who speaks about 50 languages. We go after him because we just think he's a good dude, like, and he wears that language lightly. And the thing about Andy is, he's just the best guy. He's like super trustworthy, super hardworking, full of ideas, wears his knowledge lightly. And I just think to myself, how many people can have that much knowledge and be prepared still to come in? Because football media is pompous, right? The people it attracts are pompous people, right? They are. I'm probably guilty of that, right? But having said that, I don't feel comfortable in those kind of football's the most important thing in the world type thing. I don't think anyone's watched or loved football more than me in this country ever. Like, I mean, there's people who love it as much, but I do love it. But I don't care how important it is. Like, it's the most important, the least important things is what we try and say, right? How many people like Andy with that CV, with that knowledge, with that intelligence, will happily come and sit 2-3 times a week with us and have the piss ripped out of him and laugh it off and think it's great, right? He not only did that, he went and built out on the continent with us. He takes pretty much sole responsibility for that, along with our production team. He's really an exec producer of that and a co-host. He's driving us forward all the time. So it's about personality type and the right fit and freshening it up and making it more interesting and giving different perspectives. That's what it's all about.
It's a risk with podcasts, though, isn't it? Because I think for me, when I listen to a podcast, one of the reasons I listen, the main reason I listen to something is because I like the people that are on it.
Yeah.
It doesn't even necessarily have to be what they're saying. If you bring in new people and your listeners react negatively, that's something you must have weighed up.
Yeah, no one's more unlikable than me, though. So
that's not true.
So no, they're both likable guys, and we knew that. Like, you can't please everyone all the time. Even if I remember I saw something on Instagram the other day. And it was a video of David Attenborough with a Galapagos tortoise, right? First comment, I think he's an absolute w***er. It's like, there's people out there who don't like David Attenborough. So what's the point of trying to please everyone all the time, right? So yeah, it's a risk, but it's a calculated risk. And it's what's most important, as you touched on there, is the chemistry and the dynamic of the people on the show. And those guys fit. I think, obviously it was part of a wider thing we did to be more diverse with having Jules and Kate and Vish and Andy on. Things shake out the way they shake out. I mean, it's not for me to speak about Jules and Kate because they're not here to talk about themselves, but they've gone on to other things, and that's just how it goes sometimes. As I said to you earlier, in a different context, we're a small fish in a pretty big pond, right? We can't keep everyone all the time. We understand that, we're Crew Alexandra, bringing players through sometimes, and then some people come along and snap them up, and we can't stand in their way.
Speaking more broadly about football sports media, you said there that you think quite a lot of people in it are quite pompous. What do you think of as good? What's good sports media content to you? What
I like is, and I think this is really underserved and really underrated in our industry, I like to get what I'm being told I'm going to get. And what I mean by that is, if I watch, say, a Sky Sports Super Sunday, and I'm only picking that at random, I'm just no particular actor on there, and I watch the 1:30 game and the 4:00 game, and as I'm sure you know, they'll set up the studio at the 4:00 game place, and they'll do the 1:30 game from there, and they'll go all the way through the day. And say it'll be 3 pundits and a presenter, right? What I want out of that is I want to be entertained or informed or given some insight into the game. That's the role of punditry in modern football broadcasting. What I think sometimes happens is that you get a lot of what you don't want. I'm only speaking from my point of view around like things like, let's have a laugh and let's have banter and all this kind of stuff. And my feeling is that if football broadcasting on the game day itself should be about that, then get some entertainers in. Don't get some football players in, because that's not their strength. If I want to watch this, if I want to watch the Saturday Social on Saturday morning with Sky Sports, I know that's not really for me. Like, you're not going to put Roy Keane on that. You're not going to put, whoever, Andy Brassel on that, right? It's probably a show that's for young people. It's going to be clipped up for social media. They're going to talk about a load of things that people of my age don't care about. I get that. And I think far too often in sports media now, we're delivered stuff that it's not as advertised. If you want to make an entertainment show with Gary Neville, Roy Keane, whatever, they do it. It's called The Overlap. You can go and listen to it if you want. You can go and watch it if you want. People choose to do that. I see far too much like crossover between like, and I don't want to be this kind of stay in your lane type of guy, but we have to deliver the stuff we're supposed to be delivering. The reason the Ramble works, in my view, is because we're not young, shouty YouTubers, nor are we kind of ex-pros who are a bit awkward and a bit kind of boring. We occupy that kind of 1 foot in football, 1 foot in entertainment. And I think a lot of the time these days in sports media, the lines get blurred. Everyone wants to be funny. Everyone wants to do quote unquote banter. Everyone thinks that the banterification of content is the golden goose and that everyone wants it. And I don't actually think that's the case. I think you could easily do a really good in our time, Radio 4 in our time type thing about football, which is quite earnest and very insightful. Or you could do a comedy show, which they do, you know, it does happen. I just want to know what I'm getting. And I think these days, the lines are blurred massively. Do you know what I mean by that? Have I explained that well?
Yeah, 100%. I also think though, that there's an opportunity for all of it to exist.
There's room for everything, totally. Someone once said to me very early in my career, an old producer that I worked with said, the problem is in this world is that everyone wants to be funny. Everyone wants to think they're funny. And whether they know it or not, they try to be funny. And obviously some people are funny and some people aren't. And if you get people who aren't funny, like Chris Sutton and Robbie Savage, and ask them to try and be funny, it'll be shit. It's not a great surprise, is it? You know, sometimes I listen to too much stuff or watch too much stuff and think, who is this for? What are we getting out of this? You know, 606 is a great example. Amazing legacy, like a brilliant radio show. One of the greatest radio shows like ever. Like in my view, 606, Desert Island Discs, one or two others. Some of the greatest ever broadcasting. Like you can't get anywhere near it at its best. It's amazing. Untouchably good. And you get Robbie Savage and Chris Sutton to host it. Who's that for? Who's tuning into that? It's like a one-upmanship, like banter fest between the two most unfunny uncles at a wedding. Like no one's listening to that for that reason. That show is about the listeners. Anyone who's done 1 year of radio production could tell you this show is about the listeners. They call in, they talk about their club. In a lot of time, they talk about their club in a way that's never covered. That's the point of the platform. It should be a host and an expert who's got the respect to be interested in these clubs and have a meaningful conversation about them. That's what a radio phone-in is. How they have done it and the way they've taken it is just, in my view, just such a big dereliction of duty. I'm not sitting here saying it should be me on it. I'm not saying it should be, you know, I want to feather my own nest by doing it. I'm not interested in that. I'm just talking purely as a listener. Sometimes people get confused by what shows are supposed to be about because they don't think about the listenership and the purpose of the show in the first place.
Like one of the things that I think is quite interesting in America, right, is that they'll have like Monday Night Football, NFL broadcasts. Yeah. They create different broadcasts on ESPN for the same thing to try and work into different audiences. And we haven't really seen that here.
They're miles ahead, mate. Honestly, they are, sorry to cut you off, but they are miles ahead.
Yeah, but like you could have that, right? You could I think we've probably moved on from talking about Stak and Football Ramble here, but like you guys could do a alternate broadcast for a Super Sunday game at 4:00. Not sitting there doing the commentary, but you do.
Show me the money. Show me the money for that. I'll be up for that. No, I'll take your point. If I can interrogate the overarching point you're making there, the idea that we're clowns in a circus, right? When we're broadcasting, we're clowns in a circus. But if we know nothing about what the audience in the circus likes, we're just going to be doing tricks that may do well, may not. Like we have to think the disconnect between broadcasters and their audience is a big problem. Like it's not about staying in your lane. It's not about not branching out. And it's not about not trying new things. But sometimes you have to remember that an audience are listening to you for a reason. And the reason the show's got the success it's got is there in front of you. And you just need to do more of that sometimes. And if you want to give Savage and Sutton their own show, I can't think what that would possibly be, but it can't be that. It just can't be that. You know,
I didn't come into the studio expecting Savage and Sutton to get such a hard time, but
that's. Well, this is why Ronnie said because I'm always a straight shooter.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, like I feel like you've told me a lot of things that you don't like about sports media. What do you like? Who do you think does it well? What? I mean, apart from yourselves, obviously, but like, what do you want to see more of? Like, we've got a Euros coming up this summer. What do you want from that coverage? You personally?
Speaking specifically around the Euros, I want the football to be front and centre. I want the football to be the star of it. I'm super interested in insightful interviews with players that perhaps have an interesting story that we don't hear about much, and who've had some interesting journeys. I want the guys on the broadcast to perhaps teach me something I don't know, to explain to me why things are as they are. Like, I mean, it's easier. It's like a low-hanging fruit point to make. But you mentioned Monday Night Football and the NFL, and all the NFL coverage is always fascinating to me. But that's because I don't know anything about American football, right? So it's easy to teach me something new, right? Football's a bit trickier because everyone thinks they know loads about it. I like stuff that's going to teach me something I don't already know. It's going to make me laugh, but it's going to treat the main point of it as front and centre as possible. So I would say that, the great broadcasters who work in the same area as us, Mark Chapman, Mark Pugac, Jules Breach, genuinely great pundits, they understand that they're there to complement the football, right? They're the audience surrogate to, say it's Jules doing something pitch side with someone, like she's going to speak to Pep Guardiola before the game. Jules understands she's the audience surrogate. She's asking the questions that we're not able to ask because we're not there. Now, I know there's a whole lot of protocol that comes along with that, a whole lot of restrictions. I'm sure there's loads of stuff that she wants to ask, but she can't. But within those parameters, she knows that that's what she needs to do. The fatal mistake is when you start to think you're bigger than the football itself. So Keys and Gray, people thought they were tuning in for them, but they weren't, right? I think that I'm not going to compare anyone to Keys and Gray because I don't think that would be fair on them, on the people, not on Keys and Gray. But like Gary Neville came through with Jamie Carragher on Monday Night Football, and it was brilliant. I think Carragher's still brilliant. I think he's absolutely fantastic. Like, he is just the right pitch, the right balance, like clever enough to really distill things down to punters like me, but not too clever that he alienates people and gets them to switch off. And I get the impression with Carragher that he doesn't want to be the centre of attention. He doesn't want to be the kid in the middle of the circus. He wants to be doing his job because he loves it.
Neville, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the mistake that's made is that these people think they're entertainers like in a different way. And the Monday Night Football thing is great because they've got so much room to kind of investigate things and talk about things that perhaps aren't always on the agenda because there's not as much time, and they do it in such a way where it's really accessible and they know what they're talking about. I love Monday Night Football. I think David Jones is brilliant. Like, he's really good because he's like firm enough to like push back on stuff, but he's so genial as well. Like, there's loads of really good people out there. I don't want to come away from this interview being like, Luke hates everything and thinks he's better than everyone else. It's not that at all, because I've tried to do TV and I was terrible at it and I couldn't do it, and so that's why I'm not doing it now, right? So I get it's hard, but there's loads of amazing people out there. But honestly, so many. I think outside of the football thing, I love Alistair Campbell and Roy Stewart, and I love The Rest Is History as well. They're two of my most listened to shows. I love Crooked Media in the US. I love loads of narrative stuff. I love listening to, I think it's probably why I'm so passionate about 606. I loved listening to that. I love the 5 Live coverage of games to the point of where...
Oh, I love Clinton Morrison on 5 Live. Literally the bloke who sounds the most happy ever watching
Right,
football.
so he's happy. At least he wants to be there, right? I sometimes relish the idea that I've got to drive somewhere when there's a big game on because I can listen to it on the radio. Because radio is really the first love I had in this whole thing. So, yeah, there's loads of stuff I like.
Interesting that you said football's kind of at the centre of what sports media is. That's why people tune in, right?
Yeah.
People don't tune into football to watch the pre-match interviews, and either don't really tune in to watch the halftime stuff. But what you do, they tune in to hear you kind of do an expanded version of what those shows are. It's the stuff that goes around football.
Yeah, but I think we're kind of Statler and Waldorf, though, aren't we? Do you know what I mean? In the Muppets, the two older guys who set up.
You're going to have to explain this metaphor.
So basically, in the Muppets, there's these two guys, old guys, called Statler and Waldorf, and one of them's got a mustache, and they are old guys.
They come out the little,
and they just take the piss out of everything.
Right.
That's us. That's quite an easy job. People are coming to us for a different reason. I think they're coming to us for maybe sometimes a little bit of insight or an idea that we kind of want to articulate that maybe people haven't thought about. But they're basically coming to us to have a fun, and that's really what I was talking about earlier. Like, it may be some kind of alternative broadcast option, but people aren't going to want to hear us do that on Monday Night Football. It's just not what the show is. So I think our job is easier in a way because we're just standing there poking fun at stuff.
But you do it in a way. I mean, like I was listening to one of the most recent ones, and you're talking about Romanian twins. Like, there's not that many football podcasts talking about those Romanian twins.
Yeah, the ones who one got his twin brother to play instead of him. Yeah, that's perfect stuff for us. That's a way of us sort of. I think also, as I said earlier, football's the most important, least important things. It's also like a complete circus, isn't it? I keep using the word circus, but it is. And I think that lends itself to that kind of chat, because you get to point out the stuff and puncture the balloon of like other people treating it like it's so important. Like, when time we're recording this on Sunday, I mean, maybe quite so much now because it's basically settled, but on Sunday, the Premier League title race will be seen as the most important thing ever, right? It will be done with such earnestness and such kind of seriousness that I think there's a lot of people out there just think, oh yeah, but I'd love to hear what the Ramble wants to say about it because it'll be funny, right? And we're looking to poke fun. We're looking to puncture the balloon whenever we can, like pop it as much as possible. With like the anti-Sky Sports, I suppose.
How do you go about picking what's the right bits for you to cover, going out picking Romanian twins? I mean, obviously that one probably kind of smacks you in the face a little bit.
Well, lots of our listeners just send stuff to us. Love to get the Ramble's take on this, right? But we've got a production team. So Stak is a team of...
But you've got to select it, right? You do the show. I mean, your production team will select the show.
They're really good. They are really good. We don't have a separation of on-air and off-air talent at Stak. So one of the things that turned me off the most when I went to do stuff at the BBC sometimes was how much of a barrier there was between the on-air talent, which they used to call talent, and staff. And to me, that seemed completely wrong. Like to refer to groups of people in that way, it necessarily creates an unnecessary barrier between a collaboration that needs to happen to make great stuff. And my take on it, on bad shows I hear and see, are that the production staff aren't empowered. Like there's too much of an imbalance of power. Like I would personally argue that, when Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand did all that stuff, the Andrew Sachs thing, it's because the producer's not strong enough. There's no one going in there going, you cannot do this. And here's why you can't do this. And this isn't your show. This is our show. And I've got a stake in this. And this is what we should be doing instead. It's a huge failure of production. So when we built Stak, what we tried to build in was this idea that the production team are as important. Like, one can't exist without the other. So of course we trust and empower our production team to populate running orders and put stories in. And then before each recording, we'll sit down and say, look, do we want to do this? Like, are we happy with this? So a lot of it comes from them because they're hardworking and brilliant, and they trawl the internet and they find great stuff and they filter out the stuff listeners send in or that kind of stuff. And then they go up to a point and then they stop. Like, we obviously don't have them giving us opinions because that would be stupid. Like, they won't present an opinion. They'll just say, this is what's happened. This is the story. And then we kind of interpret it. So yeah, of course they do a lot of that stuff. I'm running Stak and I've got a 1-year-old son and I've got 5, 6, 7 shows to do a week. I'm not doing that as well. It's impossible. Yeah, the team do it.
Interesting that you sort of from where you started to that point in that period. I think like one of the sort of interesting aspects for me is like the role of like YouTube. In that there are no producers really, right?
YouTube's really interesting in podcasting now and in the media landscape generally.
Yeah, we could probably spend another half hour talking about that, but. You talk about like some of the responsibility stuff of it. Have you gone from a show where you were doing all of it to having that hands-off thing? Is there anything that you feel like you've lost in the professionalisation of the Ramble a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really important thing to be aware of, because when you professionalise something, you do lose like almost like a grassroots kind of, whatever you want to call it, punk, grassroots, whatever kind of ethic. But we all made a conscious decision that we wanted to make money out of this and make a success of it, and it was better than having a proper job. And we all took that conscious decision to move forward with it. And sometimes you do lose something, but I don't think YouTube's interesting for that reason. No, I think YouTube's interesting because it's an entirely different way of broadcasting that is actually anathema to how traditional media does it. And I think it's really empowering, and I think it can be toxic, obviously, and it can be difficult because the regulation is almost non-existent. But it also undoubtedly gives voices to hugely talented people who would not even be looked at twice in mainstream normal media. And I think ultimately that's a good thing. What we try and do with how we professionalise and how we try not to lose that stuff is try and really accentuate the fun things that the broadcasters are good at and take away the variables and the other stuff from them so they haven't got to worry about that. But if Marcus was sitting here now, he wouldn't say his strength was organisation or, planning of certain things, or even writing running orders or whatever. He can write a running order for himself. Of course he can. He did it for years. But why not get someone else to relieve that burden for you, to free you up, to use all your capacity to make the best show you can? So there's kind of probably two different ways of looking at that.
Let's dig into YouTube a little bit. Like, what's its role for you guys? How do you use it, and where do you see it going?
It's a massive discovery platform for podcasts now, and they've consciously lent into that, and they've put budget behind it and dished out money to certain creators for putting their podcast full episodes on YouTube and stuff like that. And so I think it may even be the second biggest discovery platform for podcasts now. I don't know if that's an age thing or just how the ecosystem changes, but a huge amount of people will search for podcasts on YouTube and they won't even necessarily watch the video. It's just a platform they like to use, right? So we have to be mindful of that. And then initially we were kind of reticent to be too much in hock to YouTube because the CPMs are so much lower than they are for podcasting. So like per 1,000 listens, it's a tenth on YouTube than it is on podcasting, right? Because of how the industries have grown up. We then kind of discovered, or we believe, that the audience on YouTube is different. So actually you're not cannibalizing anything, you're just reaching more people. So it's important for us to be on there, not just for the clips that are shared and to promote the show, but actually the show itself, because that's where people want to listen. And ultimately it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have to put a listener at the heart of everything you do. And it's not just what do they want to hear. It's like, how do they want to hear it? What do they want to do? How are they going to go about it? I can't beat every single individual listener over the head saying you're listening to this show wrong. They're going to do what they want to do. So we have to be there whenever we can be there. It's no different to a product being on the shelf in a shop, right? You want to be as many shops as possible because you want people to buy your stuff. Like, that's just how it is. So YouTube is massively important now.
I feel like that's almost the whole lesson of the digitization of media. Is actually like previously very much dog wag tail, now it's very much tail wags dog.
Yeah, and I've also worked in it alongside it in a slightly different way because I had Jack Dean. Jack, mate, he was a big YouTuber, still is a big YouTuber, I suppose, really, but he wanted to make a podcast, and I knew him before. I just knew him because he liked the Ramble and we were friends, and he said, look, I tried to do a podcast before, it didn't really work, can we do it with Stak? And so we did it. And he now does it on his own. Like, he did 3 years with us and he went on and did his own thing, and they're actually currently on tour doing a live theatre show at the moment. It's called Jack Mate's Happy Hour, and we developed the show together, and it was Jack's kind of vision, and we gave him the production support he needed, and we got him a Spotify deal to go exclusive with them, and it was a very successful commercial relationship for us, and that's fine. But the thing that was really interesting for me is Jack's younger than me. He's grown up entirely in YouTube, so his process was, look, I've invested this money in converting one of my rooms in my house to a YouTube studio. If I want to do a video about something, I just do it. Here's how I do it. Here's how I edit it. Here's how I know listeners like it. This is what the thumbnail's going to be. This is what the title's going to be. This has been what worked for me. And bang, I've got 1 million subscribers on YouTube, right? You can't just transpose that across identically to podcasting, because it was incumbent upon me to say to him, that's brilliant. That's why you're here. That's why we want to work with you, right? Because you're already popular. Our job is to convert this into a podcast as successfully as possible. But not only that, but to bring through podcast listeners as well. And so what I learned from Jack was just how good he was at knowing his audience. I had done a lot of mainstream media work. I had done telly work, I'd done radio work, I'd done podcast work. If I went into a radio station around that time and said to the people presenting, or even the people producing, who's a listener for this? What's this for, right? Invariably, they wouldn't be able to tell me. But I did a show on the radio station on a Friday night, and it was very much pitched at a certain audience. And I knew the whole time, and I would articulate this, and people wouldn't really listen. Every single person of this type that we're targeting with this show is in the pub. They're not listening. They're simply not listening. It's 7 till 10 on a Friday night. What do you think they're doing? They've been working all week. They're in the pub. Why are we making the show for them? Like, why aren't we making the show for people who are actually going to listen to it? And you would never get that with a YouTuber. Pros and cons of YouTube aside, whatever you think about YouTube as a medium, the most successful ones, they know their audience better than anyone else. Like, no other media platform knows their audience as well. And that's why they're so successful, because they're forensic with it. They know exactly who they are. And they get so much data back, and they get so much insight into who's listening for how long and what works and what doesn't. They are constantly adjusting and adapting and changing things. And you just don't get that in traditional media, because there's just not a tradition of doing it.
Do you get that in podcasting? I know from our own back end. I know from our back end what we get. I don't know how good that is.
It's definitely valuable to podcasters. You get all the data you need. But we've gone, with some shows we've had, like the Ramble, we've gone too serious sometimes. We've made changes that haven't resonated. We've had to fight really hard to get audience back or to go and get a different audience because we try to do things that haven't worked. And there's been pig-headedness on my part, probably forcing things through when they shouldn't have been. And so, yeah, I think you do. I think you should do. But so much of podcasting now is, of course, traditional media people coming into podcasting, right, doing their thing. I was seeing the podcast show next week. One of the keynote speakers is James Corden. I mean, what's the point of that? My point is not just to be controversial for the sake of it. My point is that I understand we want to attract new people to the medium. I get it. It can't just be a closed shop. We don't want that. We want to be taken seriously. We want to be talked about. We want to be successful. But far too often, it's happened at awards ceremonies, it's happened at trade shows. People come in with no tradition in podcasting whatsoever, and they're there just because people know who they are. James Corden currently does an American radio show that, as far as I know, isn't able to be listened to in the UK. What's he providing as insight to podcasting to a podcast audience at a podcast trade show? I've got no beef with him necessarily. I don't know the guy, but I'm just asking, what's the reason he's been booked, if you know what I mean? And so that's a problem in podcasting. So we can talk about adjusting and adapting and really leveraging our audiences and being thoughtful about it. There's a lot of entryism as well because people want to be part of a successful thing. And I think we've got to be mindful of that as well, because we've got to create our own stories. We've got to create our own stars. We've got to create our own shows that of the type of a Mastermind or a Desert Island Discs or a great movie franchise. That's available to us in podcasting, and we need to concentrate on that.
Final question then. This is a nice easy one. What happens next? Where do you go next? What are you working on?
We want to lean into sports. We want to make really exciting, successful sports shows. We're good at that. We've got a reputation for doing that. They don't have to all be like the Ramble. They don't have to all be going after that audience. But I think we should be proud of the fact that we've generated the amount of listeners we've generated and the amount of episodes and the amount of downloads and the amount of revenue that we've generated as an independent business starting from scratch with a company that really only existed in our heads, and now it's out in the real world. We need to win the argument with people that we are among the best people doing that, and there's a reason people should come to us to make it. So if you're someone in sport and you've got a great sport broadcasting background or a great idea, come to us. You could go to the BBC, you could go to Sky, you could go to these different places, but you're not going to get the same level of service and the level of experience in podcasting specifically, and the room and like the flexibility and the collaborative relationship that you'll have from an independent, dedicated company where you only have to deal with a handful of people, and actually much more of the share of the revenue and the credit will go to you. And we have to get better at winning that kind of argument with people and giving people the option and encouraging them to take it. We basically need to be salespeople for what we do. Like, that's what we need to do more of. And I think if we can do that, I think we can hopefully go on to be an even more exciting story than we are now. And that's what I'd like us to do. And that's what I'm trying to implore our team to kind of visualize.
All right, Lee Moore, I think that's a really nice place to leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.